first and foremost for coming out. Tonight was not a very pleasant journey in some respects, in the weather and the cold and the rain and that sort of thing. But thank you. I wasn't expecting this many people to come. So thank you for all journeying out from your comfy homes to join us this evening. As Tom had stated earlier, we're Ernest and Camryn Smith. Some of you are very familiar faces. Some of you are new faces, new friends. We are asset-based community development facilitators and congregational coaches, and we have a consultant and coaching organization called Neighborhood Allies. And there's many facets to our organization. I'm trying to wait till Ernest gets up. PowerPoint. There we go. Are we going to cut the light off? Oh. Okay. So here we go. We have Neighborhood Allies. And we made this nice little beginning slide just specifically for you guys here at Pilgrim. So we're talking about beyond charity, addressing causes and empowering people. Can we go to?
Yeah.
Did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
So we'll do a tag team thing. So one of the things that I was excited about in coming tonight is the concept of empowering people. I think a lot of the programs that happen, they're well-meaning and well-intentioned, but if you don't empower the people, you're missing a strong component of how something can be sustainable. And that's one of the things that we focus on in asset-based community development.
Community. This is a very common proverb that is quoted over again in community development circles. Go to the people, live among them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have. But the best of leaders, when their task is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. And that's basically the essence of what Ernest and I try to live out personally and what we try to train other people to do as well.
I appreciated what David Reese said about no one trying to take credit, because that's essentially what we're talking about, is trying to do something not for ourselves, but we're doing something for the folks that we're in neighborhood with.
In Neighborhood Allies, we see communities that are often viewed as troubled and problematic, as places that have beauty and have gifted individuals often waiting to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. We seek to help organizations, institutions, and churches walk with those individuals in a life-affirming way. We have 3 areas of focus. The first one is congregational and organizational coaching, parish-based engagement and community advocacy, and the third is consulting.
So with congregational and organizational coaching, we seek to help organizations move from what we call a needs-based focus, which is, by the way, let me just back up just a little bit. As David was describing Old East Durham, I say Old East Durham because the area that we live in is Old East Durham. We've moved to that area because we wanted to be a part. When we came back to Durham, one of the things that we looked at, we wanted to be in a community where we could actually be a part of bringing change into that community. And I've lived in Durham and other places. I've lived in suburbia, but the thing that we love most is we love our community. There's life there, there's vibrancy. Yes, we have challenges, but there is so much good that's going on in our community. And there's one of the things that we strongly believe, and I think we probably have it in another slide, is that God is there. And that's where we start with our belief, is that God is in the community. And so what we want to do is help churches and organizations who want to do work in those communities do so from a perspective of valuing the people that are there and understanding that there's a dignity there and there's a way that we can walk with people in a more productive way.
And we do that by helping organizations move from a needs-based model of working in communities to a more culturally aware development model that brings more sustainable results. We love this quote by Leela Watson, which is an Aboriginal activist. If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. We firmly believe that there's different types of poverty. There is spiritual poverty, there's relational poverty, there's impoverished people that suffer from poverty, of not having people to care, supportive systems in place on many different levels. And the people in our community, or communities similar to ours, I guess the most common thing that people think of is the lack of material poverty. And Ernest and I both are dedicated to helping congregations because we believe that often overlooked huge asset in every city is the faith communities. No matter what your faith community is, I don't think we facilitate our communities of faith as much as we should. It's a very powerful poverty alleviation think tank we have in our faith communities. And so we try to help organizations or churches, instead of going in and focusing on the problems. So many people in this room do see the problems in East Durham because all the time people focus on all the problems. But there's a lot of beauty in my community. There are people that sit on porches every summer when I'm driving by and they wave at me. There are people when I walk by their house, they talk to me. I mean, now all of a sudden there's gardens cropping up everywhere all over East Durham. I'm looking forward to, again, spring all over again. We have community potlucks. There was a gentleman saying him and his wife would love to have a couple of raised beds in their yard. There's kids that run our neighborhood farm. There's all sorts of, we have wonderful summer programs, crafts. We're going to start a quilting club with some of the elders in our community, passing down this generational blessing that we've had in our community of African American quilting. There's so many wonderful things in our community that I think a lot of people, unless you live there and reside there, you really don't, or have a connection of someone who does, you just don't realize what's going on. So we try to help organizations that come into communities get in contact with people who live there or who are working there, who know about all these assets and these resources, to help join in with them instead of 2 or 4 communities.
I think Cameron said it well when she talked. I don't need the mic. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay. I think she said it well. We look for community leaders, people that are part of the community who have shown some leadership in the community because they're there. And instead of, as institutions and organizations come to do good things in the community, we help them value the people of the community and work with. Instead of saying a top-down approach which says, let me come and let me, do this program, how about let's come together? And again, I appreciated what both Tasha and David said about, that relational component is necessary for success.
Yeah, I think, and especially Tasha mentioning that so many people, we are huge fans of the Circles program. And I think the wonderful blessing about that is the reciprocity that people of material wealth or material privilege have with people that have been in material poverty. Because there's a lot of things, even though I live in East Durham, I am still a person of privilege. I chose to live there. We were able to buy a house. We're able to sustain our bills. I have a relatively full pantry. My kids all basically were a part of honor society. I mean, there's so many things that I am a person of privilege just because I live in my community. But at the same time, I can't go in there with the attitude of thinking because of all these things and because my neighbor next door, maybe her son flunked out of school and dropped out of school, that I know everything. Well, that doesn't mean that's the case at all, because I had a husband who loved me, who took care of me in a lot of ways. I had a very stable middle-class upbringing. But for the grace of God, if I had had something very different than that, I don't know where I would be. And so I think a lot of times we take for granted in this highly individualistic culture of American idealism that we're seeing now, especially in our political climate, that everybody can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. We take for granted that a lot of us, as we were even conceived, had a system of support wrapped around us that helped to facilitate our success in so many ways, that helped us to have all those wonderful lessons and opportunities, to have the giftings brought out in us, whereas some kids who are born in poverty never have those abilities. It doesn't mean that that gifting isn't there. It just means that they don't have those opportunities. Poverty robs you of chances. It robs you of dreams. It robs you of so many different things, not because of the lack that's within the person. It's because of the lack of opportunities that have not been given.
Let me just share one other thought.
Ernest, please, the mic. There are a couple of
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share one other thought real quick. It's as you guys go into the community and begin to do work, whatever that work might be, I would like for you to consider engaging the people that you're working with in a new and fresh way. In other words, and we talked about this with other organizations, from the very inception of what it is that you're thinking you may want to do, include folks of the community. Because if you're just coming in from a middle class perspective and trying to force something into something, you need to hear at least from the folks that you're wanting to serve what it is that their desires are, what it is that their needs are. And from the very inception of any program that you may want to consider doing, we encourage you to involve people of the community. Otherwise, it's just not as successful. It wears us out as far as those who want to go do good, and then we get tired because we don't see the results that we had anticipated. We had this great idea, and we come in, and then after a while, the community may not buy into it, and then we say, well, we have this great thing. It's their fault. Well, maybe we need to look at what it is that we did when we went in to bring our solution rather than listen to what they have to say.
The third area of focus is consulting. We consult with organizations around issues of cultural competence, grassroots community engagement, asset-based community development, and moving from charity to empowerment. And so a lot of times, when majority culture people, and I consider just about everybody in this room majority culture people, or we have a majority of our life in majority culture, middle class people, we go into there's a whole culture in communities like mine. And so as someone of somewhat material privilege, when I walk into different environments within my community, I have to know when to be quiet. I have to know how to act. I have to know how to position myself. I have to think about my facial expressions. I have to think about the words that I use because our words are so powerful. I have to be very intentional with just about everything that I do because I can use my words and my attitudes to oppress someone and to rob them of their dignity. Just by my very presence of walking in, I can rob people of their humanness by my middle class values. And so a lot of times we as well-meaning middle-class people go into communities of material poverty, and without any sort of discussion or training in this area, we end up doing a lot of harm than good. A lot of times organizations or churches will go in and they'll start off really good for the first couple of weeks, but all of a sudden they see attitudes of the people change, or people start to feel suffocated because they feel as if people are just there to get what they can get and not necessarily build a relationship. And a lot of times this is due to a lack of cultural competency training and not understanding that there's cultural dynamics in play. And sometimes we as middle class people need to have very frank and open and honest discussions. You cannot start talking about poverty alleviation, and particularly in the South, well, all over the nation, but particularly in Durham, without talking about issues of race and privilege. These are very difficult discussions to have, especially in a very well-educated community like Durham, because most of us do have, at very least, 4-year degrees or master's degrees, and we think ourselves so far beyond racial dynamics or being biased. But we all are guilty of biases that we don't even know that we have. And even though we are well-meaning and don't realize that, we end up doing harm by saying things that we are totally unaware of. So Ernest and I try to sit down and have open dialogues, or facilitate open dialogues about these very issues that people, well-meaning people, end up unknowingly step foot in a hole, so to speak, sometimes. So because it's a huge, people know when they're being talked down to. People know when they're not being honored. We worked for a couple of years with the Roma people in Eastern Europe, and one of the things, and in a third world village condition, I mean, it was absolutely horrible. And one of the things that we taught our kids from the very beginning is when we go to the gypsy village, there is not what you drink, what they offer you. You hug, you do not turn away, you eat with them, you do not flinch, because by us they are all the time being rejected. And if we are sent here to give humanitarian aid and love, how dare we come in with the same attitude that other people so often treat them with? And so it's kind of something that we have to train ourselves, because we do things unknowingly. It's not that we mean to hurt, but if we are coming to be servants of communities, we have to have very real and frank discussions about this. So that's the end of our presentation about organization. And what we thought we'd do for the last few minutes is basically part of what we do as asset-based consultants is we have different levels of modules of training that we have, and we're going to go through very quickly one of our first module that we have, just a little bit of the first module because it actually is a day and a half of training that we have. And so and we're going to hold another one in May, and we do offer trainings for just general trainings, and we also do church-based trainings. We'll come to your church as well and just hold trainings just specifically for your organizations. And so we're going to talk about the practices, the 5 basic practices of asset-based community development is discovering assets within a community, and we're not talking about fiscal assets, we're talking about basically the assets in human capital, the things that generally speaking in this Western culture we do not value, how people relate to each other, the history of the community, the diversity within the community, whether or not people are gardening, how people treat each other, the elders in the community, what capacities and giftings that they have, the youth, what are they interested in.
One of the things that, and I try to hit a balance because I think we all should. The fact is that when you're looking at a materially poor community, you see some of the things that you see are the challenges that those communities face. And organizations, when they present, they want to present the need because that's what is in front of you. But living in Old East Durham, the things that I see are beauty. I see we build relationships with the people as they're walking down the street or as we're walking down the street. When you're driving through a community, you don't get to see all the beauty. You don't get to see the mothers playing with their children. You don't get to see or have those conversations of two neighbors sitting on the porch together. And quite frankly, even in our community, we have some sense of more of a neighborhood than we felt in some of our suburban neighborhoods that we lived in. Although those were great experiences, there's something of value that we're getting from the community that we now live in, and we cherish that.
Second is the assets we do include as associations, organizations, churches, faith communities, clubs, things of that nature. Number 2, discovering what people care enough to act upon, which is usually when we have trainings within our community, we do what we call appreciative inquiry. On the second day, we send you out into the community and basically to knock on doors or to ask people as they're working in their yards. There's 2 questions that we ask you. The first ask you to ask them first is, if money was not an issue and you had a magic wand, what would you do what would you change in this community? And then the second question that you ask is, what is it that you're willing to do to make that change happen? And so by asking people, and a lot of people in our community, you would be surprised, when we sent the first team out to do this a couple of years ago, people were shocked because they're always asked what changes that they want, but they never are asked, what are you willing to do about it? Because nobody really thinks that the people in the community have the answers to their own liberation, which they do. Poor people know the answers to their own liberation. It just takes us with our opportunities and our networks to help bridge that gap, which is part of what Tasha at Circles of Support does so well. And so that's one of the things that we really value. Number 3 is mobilizing groups to act. We help community organize from an asset-based perspective, which basically is highly relational. We encourage leaders in the community to talk, to get to know their neighbors, to build capacity through long-term engagement, not just coming together to picket or something of that nature, but it's interwoven. We want to eat together. We want to live together. We want our kids to play together. We want to garden together. And so when it does become time to act, generally speaking, we have more engagement from people because they feel like I'm not by myself really. I'm going to go to this meeting even though 5 or 6 people show up. That's more than what showed up 3 or 4 years ago. And so that's part of our community organizing. Different roles for people in programs, realizing that programs sometimes are not driven by people, and are not driven by caring about people. Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they are. But differentiating between the two, knowing that people are highly evolved creatures, that we are highly relationally based, that we value people over programs, and that programs have their proper place. And leading by stepping back as not only people of privilege, but also as organizations, that we make sure that we're not co-opting people and going before them, because people who have grown up materially poor, resource poor, a lot of times will let people who are slicker, more educated than them kind of step up and take the lead. But we try to step back and push the people in our community to the forefront and let them lead. One of some of the tenets that we recognize is that God is already there. God was already in our community well before we even had heard about East Durham. We do not do for others what they can do for themselves. This is a prime, basic ideal that I know Durham Can uses, and we highly tout Durham Can. If any of you have ever had a thought about joining, that's a really good organization. We are kind of like the parish-based neighborhood model. They are very good systemically. And so the two together really make for a good combination. We really think highly of Durham Can. Start with what you have. We try to use the resources within our community. We've been having community potlucks. We had a year anniversary this past February. At the second or third potluck that we had last year, the community decided that they wanted to have a neighborhood cleanup and a block party. And basically everybody broke into groups right there and they planned it. We had very little organizational oversight and help. All the food was donated by people that lived in that community. We fed over 150 people that day, and we still had leftovers. The games were all organized by people that live in the community. They bought the crafts, they manned the game table. We had different people who live in our community that had ties with certain organizations that donated one or two of the game. We had a game truck that came and they had that set up. But it was the same type of carnival that would go on in any other middle-class neighborhood, where the neighbors just band together and they pull together their own resources or their connections. And so from that we've had a trunk or treat at our neighborhood. The kids in our community were not trick-or-treating because the parents didn't feel safe. So we decided in our potlucks, they said, well, let's have a trunk or treat. And so that's what we did. We had, I think, 10 or 15 cars in the parking lot at Shepherd's house. And then some of the neighbors who own houses on Main Street decided we just don't want this to be segregated just at Shepherd's house. So within a 1-block radius each way, we had houses that were open. And so we had kids walking up and down the street. We had probably around 150 to 175 in attendance for that. We had a Christmas party, the same thing. We had caroling going on, craft tables. Everybody donated food. It's been wonderful to be a part of people who, and you can tell when people just don't have enough, but they bring what they have. And they're very proud of what they have and sharing with each other. So it's been a beautiful thing. Relocation, redistribution, and reconciliation are the 3 tenets of Christian Community Development Association. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dr. John Perkins, and it's the oldest Christian Community Development Association in the United States. But those are the 3 tenets. Relocation is what Ernest and I have done. If you're familiar with Jonathan Wilson Hargrove and the Ruba House community over in Walltown, very similar to a parish-based model where we're very place-based. We're very grounded in where we are. We're dedicated to that area. Redistribution, not necessarily of material wealth, but also of what we have so far as opportunities or connections, similar to what Tasha was mentioning earlier, and reconciliation, which is basically reconciling us to each other along the lines of poverty versus privilege, racial, gender, whatever the reconciliation would call for. And realize that we can do more together than alone. There is no one in our community we don't need, from the oldest to the youngest. And we are strong believers in restorative justice for our reentry population. We do believe that people are not dictated by the worst thing that they've ever done. I know in a lot of situations that's very tough for us. And it's not an easy road to walk. For us, we are very relational in everything that we do. So we try to live together. We're going to fail, but we fail together. We get up together. We love each other. We encourage each other.
So there are three different approaches to community development. The first is gentrify them. How many of you have heard of gentrification? So I don't need to describe what that is. So basically, what involves gentrification is displacing the poor. And we had a friend who was a missionary who had their house in a community. They bought it, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And they were away for 10 of those years, and they came back, and they said, wow, this neighborhood is so much better than it used to be. When we bought it, it wasn't this way. Prayer walking is really working. What had happened was people came in and displaced a lot of people. And, and so gentrification is, the phrase that I like to use is gentrification with justice, because we do want to see the community uplifted, but we don't want to see people displaced. And so we want to do it in a way, bring our community up in a way that values the people of the community. Another way of community development is pouring resources into a community, doing a needs assessment, just looking at what are the problems of the community. So let's create a program in order to work on these problems. Well, and that can work in some ways, and there are some times that you need programs that have that needs focus. We don't dismiss that at all. We recognize that needs are something that we have to look at. But if that's the only approach, then we're missing something great, which we believe is the asset-based way, which is discovering who's there, discovering the gifts, and building relationships and allowing the community itself to build itself up.
We're going to skip. So these are the three modes that we talk about, organizations and particularly churches. Involvement in a community, there are quite a few examples of that in my community. We have a high rate of commuter laity. There's a lot of churches in my community, and most of them are attended by people who live outside in the suburbs. So they commute in and they leave, and then usually the building is not available or available for people within my community to use for reading programs, children's programs, things of that nature. They kind of close up, and they're only open on Sunday mornings, generally speaking, maybe on Wednesday evenings for their programs. Involvement 2 or 4 community is a lot of what we see right now going on in much larger churches, where they come in and bus a lot of people into poor communities, and they set up a lot of programs. Their agenda is driven by the leadership of their church. It's not that much relational, and they're basically doing work 2 or 4. It's not relationally based. It's based upon numbers and programs. Sometimes it's to help evangelize. Sometimes it's just for humanitarian aid. The other one is involvement with the community. An excellent model of this is Shepherd's House. Shepherd's House has opened up their doors. They are a first-generation immigrant church in our community, and they have been, even though they don't live in our community, they have been working with us for so long. They have been working with us really well, and so they are an example of a church that's been working with the community really well. So we're going to skip, and we have questions.
Do we have time for maybe one quick question? We want to end on time. We always promise to end on time.
Do you have the date for your open training in May? You know? Okay.
We're still securing the location, so the date is not yet set. We're targeting the first weekend in May, is it the first? But we're still trying to secure the location. But we do have a sign-up sheet for interest.
If you want to, yeah, we can email you the information. No problem.
Great. Where do you have the sign-up sheet?
I have it with me.
Okay.
I'll put it over there on the table.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ernest and Camryn.